Hello and welcome everyone. Marhaban bikum. I'm Nils Lewis. I'm a program manager here at the Institute, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker here tonight. Dr. Farah Al-Nakib joins us from the American University of Kuwait, where she's the director of the Center for Gulf Studies and also an assistant professor of history. She's the author of the upcoming book, Kuwait Transformed, A History of Oil and Urban Life, which I definitely encourage everyone to check out. It's out in April. I also saw it's already on Amazon for pre-order. So we're lucky, I guess, tonight to have a little bit of a preview of it, which I'm psyched to hear about. Professor Al-Nakib received her PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London, SOAS, where she looked at the history of Kuwait City before and after oil. I also learned today in talking to her that she was part of the team that created the American University of Kuwait back in 2003 and was director of admissions there for 2 years. So as a staff member here at NYUAD since the beginning, she's a little bit of a kindred spirit. So thank you for coming. And everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Farah Al-Nakib.
Thank you. Thank you to Nils and Nahid and everybody here at the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute for inviting me here to speak with you this evening. So the title of my talk this evening is Kuwait's Urban Alternative, Youth Activism and Rights to the City. On a busy Friday night in late December 2012, 26-year-old Jabir Youssef, a Lebanese dentist, argued with 4 young men over a parking space at the Avenues, Kuwait's largest shopping mall. 3 of the men followed Youssef into the mall, while the 4th went to a store and bought a meat cleaver. The men then stabbed Youssef multiple times in front of hundreds of people. No witness intervened to stop the attack, nor did anyone follow the killers when they fled. Paramedics took too long to reach the scene because of the gridlock that plagues the mall's narrow access roads on weekends, and Youssef bled out onto the mall floor as bystanders took photographs that were circulated through social media. His friends finally took him to the hospital in their own car, where he died at 1 a.m. The Avenue stabbing was followed by a spate of highly public and publicized knife crimes in Kuwait, culminating a year later with the fatal stabbing of a 24-year-old man at the Marina Mall and another fatal stabbing of a 26-year-old man this past August at the high-end 360 Mall. Though public discourse has focused on the apparent rise of violent crimes among disaffected youth in Kuwait, neither stabbings nor youth violence are in fact new to Kuwait. Rather, what was new about these crimes was their open and public nature. All occurred on busy weekends around hundreds of witnesses who chose not to intervene. While this latter sociological phenomenon is worthy of deeper examination, what stunned people most was that many of these crimes occurred in shopping malls, which one local English newspaper described as, quote, havens of recreation and relaxation, end quote. Malls are paradoxical places in the types of social feelings and behaviors they embody. People are often lulled into a false sense of security inside them. As private, enclosed, guarded, and in the Arab Gulf, often gilded places, they make people feel safer than on downtown city streets. Malls have better lighting, a steadier flow of people, fewer escape routes for muggers, roaming security guards, and so on. In its architectural design and the names of its various sections, the Avenues offers its visitors an artificial experience of shopping in a city without actually having to be in a city. Its multiple sectors include the Grand Avenue, designed to look like a British high street or an American main street, the Soku, south of Kuwait, mimicking New York's Soho district, and the Souk, replicating Kuwait's own city streets. But despite its idealized representation of a city, if the Avenues really was a city district, it would be what the American urban activist Jane Jacobs would have labeled an unsuccessful one. Quote, the bedrock attribute of a successful city district, she argues, is that a person must feel personally safe and secure on the street in the midst of strangers, end quote. In well-functioning city districts, different people are doing different things simultaneously and at different times of day, going to work, running errands, meeting clients, sleeping on park benches, taking the kids to school, loitering, waiting for the bus, running, walking the dog, shopping, having dinner, and so on. Though this diversity makes city streets seem more dangerous and unpredictable than the seemingly protected and contained mall, Jacobs argues that this is precisely what generates safety. The more diverse interactions and public contacts people have on a street, the more feelings of mutual trust can emerge among the people who use it. Trust in this context can be defined as, quote, an almost unconscious assumption of general street support when the chips are down, when a citizen has to choose, for instance, whether he will take responsibility or abdicate it in combating barbarism or protecting strangers, end quote. Though most encounters between strangers in the city are trivial and fleeting, people are silently yet constantly negotiating various public spaces with one another. These repeated casual contacts help foster feelings of a public identity, which becomes a vital resource in times of personal or collective need. When the need to negotiate difference is removed, as it is in the avenues where everyone is doing the same thing, one's engagement with the public and inherent concern for the public good erodes. Malls, like deserted city streets, are therefore prime venues for antisocial behavior, be they acts of violence or of passive non-interference. I begin my discussion with the avenues to highlight the reality that Kuwait, like other Gulf cities, is in a state of urban crisis. Here I refer to both the urban landscape, where malls have become the quintessential urban form, and to urban society. The radical transformation of the cityscape after the advent of oil in 1946 prompted substantial changes in social behaviors and relations. In 1968, 2 decades after the launch of the industry, the Greek architect George Kandilis lamented that due to the, quote, brutal dislocations in the conditions of life provoked by oil, Kuwait, both the city and the society, had lost its, quote, primordial quality of urbanity, defined for more than 2 centuries by functional, spatial, and social diversity. From the time of the town settlement in 1716 until the advent of oil in 1946, Kuwait town's socio-spatial morphology was shaped by its identity as a port. The pre-oil landscape was carved out of the everyday needs and desires of its inhabitants and users. The town was built to the scale of the pedestrian, and the narrow streets and close clustered layout of the built environment protected people from the strong sun, the spring sandstorms, and devastating winter rains. The climate, coupled with the fact that most daily activities were structured around prayer times and that there were no street lamps in use at night, made it essential that home, work, mosque, and spaces of leisure and entertainment were in close proximity to each other. People lived close to their place of work, be it the ship harbors, the souk or the market, gypsum quarries, and so on. The market, seafront, and port complex were the centers of the town's mercantile and maritime economies and the main spaces of daily activity, social exchange, and leisure. The souk was also a political space. The ruler had his office in the middle of the money changer square, where he held public audience with the townspeople every morning to hear their grievances, that's the building here, to settle disputes and administer justice. The American Missionaries' Bible shop on the right and the Al-Ahliya Library were also frequent meeting spaces for political dissidents. The town's morphology thus affected and reflected the intricate mix of private, social, and political life. This close integration of the different functions of city life stimulated a vibrant everyday urban experience in which the townspeople were constantly surrounded by different people and activities. Residential neighborhoods were also mixed in the Old Town. Most neighborhoods were formed naturally around family or occupational ties and or immigrant and patronage networks. So people of diverse religious, ethnic, and class backgrounds often resided within the same neighborhood clusters. In times of economic scarcity, people needed each other to survive, and the outcome was a society described in the 19th century as, quote, closely united and free from feuds and factions, end quote. This social reality was reflected in the intricate landscape, with its close-knit clusters of courtyard houses threaded together by narrow lanes and blind alleys that blurred the barriers between public and private realms. As a port and market town, Kuwait was a culturally cosmopolitan place, and the townspeople were accustomed to interacting with diverse people and lifestyles. Foreign travelers to Kuwait in the 18th and 19th centuries regularly described the town as a friendly and accommodating place whose residents were, quote, tolerant to others and not overly rigid to themselves, end quote. The British political resident Louis Pelly noted in 1865 that the town's inhabitants enjoyed complete religious tolerance, and religious minorities did not pay additional taxes as they did in many other Arab cities under Ottoman administration. The town's port economy not only helped foster this cosmopolitan outlook, it also depended on it. In a highly competitive region where ports regularly rose and fell in commercial prominence, Kuwait had to be a place that people from other regions like India and East Africa wanted to trade with. So oil was discovered in Kuwait in 1938, and the first barrels were exported in 1946. By 1950, it was clear that the old walled town was no longer capable of accommodating the demographic boom the country was experiencing. In 1951, a British town planning firm was commissioned to create a master plan to transform Kuwait into a modern city. The plan was based on the British New Town model and therefore emphasized the separation of activities into discrete functional zones. New residential suburbs were built outside the city, which are these blocks this is the old city center here, and these blocks are the residential areas, as well as new educational, industrial, educational, and health zones. Over the next 2 decades, the old town was demolished, its inhabitants were relocated en masse to the new suburbs, and new buildings were constructed inside the city to make it the country's center of economic and political decision-making. In sharp contrast to the mixed-use nature of the pre-oil townscape, urban life in Kuwait became highly differentiated and separated out into discrete spheres. People went to work in the city center, spent their leisure time along the coast, shopped in the new commercial district of Salmiya, and went home to rest in the suburbs, and moved between these spaces entirely by car. All Kuwaiti citizens became entitled to a state-provided dwelling after oil, and new state housing policies segregated the population into discrete residential zones. In the 1950s and 60s, the former townspeople were rehoused in new suburbs between the 1st and 4th ring roads that emanated out from the city center. From the late 1960s onwards, the more recently sedentarizing Bedouin were settled in new townships constructed far away from the city, which you can see labeled here. Non-Kuwaitis, who began migrating to Kuwait in the tens of thousands from 1946 onwards, attracted by the many new job opportunities in the country's burgeoning oil, construction, and service sectors, were restricted to commercial areas like Salmiya and Hawali, as well as the city center. As the city center was vacated of its inhabitants, the government commissioned an endless line of planners, consultants, architects, and transportation experts to come up with plans to organize and reorganize Kuwait's primate city throughout the 70s and 80s. However, despite all the time, effort, and expense, no plan for the city center was ever successfully implemented due to high levels of corruption, a chaotic planning system, and exorbitantly high land values that made city development extremely unprofitable for the state and private sector alike. Aside from the construction of some commercial and state buildings, particularly after the 1973 oil boom, large portions of the city center remained vacant and undeveloped well into the 1990s. Lack of off-street parking created severe traffic congestion, and open spaces and sidewalks were used as spontaneous car parks, inhibiting their public usability. I see people nodding. I think everyone has a feeling for what this is like. Many important everyday uses like residence, shopping, and leisure had been largely removed from the city center. What remained were banks and financial institutions, ministries and other bureaucratic organizations, offices, a couple of new hotels, the dilapidated old market area, and rapidly obsolescing apartment blocks built in the 1960s. These blocks became increasingly inhabited by thousands of male low-income migrant laborers forced by their dire economic conditions to live in communal and overcrowded conditions. As non-Kuwaitis, these communities of city residents legally had no stake in the city. They could not own businesses or establish community organizations, which are so vital to the creation and maintenance of vibrant and livable urban districts. As a result, both the laborers' living conditions in the city and the city itself steadily deteriorated. Through such modernist urban planning, Kuwait's inhabitants lost what the French urban sociologist Henri Lefebvre refers to as a right to the city. With top-down planning, he argues, the inhabitants and users of a city lose the right to create their surroundings according to their own needs and desires. The separation of activity, spheres of behavior, and people through functional zoning and social segregation, both key elements of modernist planning ideology, creates a dismembered everyday life and destroys urbanity. People become detached from the city as they move about, mostly by car, in their new suburbs. The urban core, meanwhile, becomes a place of consumption for foreigners, tourists, and suburbanites. The possibility for multiple simultaneous and integrated uses, commercial, residential, intellectual, religious, social, political, is suppressed in new, increasingly dull central business districts. This planning reality is something the residents of all Gulf cities experience acutely, most even more so than in Kuwait. To go back to Kuwait, all of the country's master plans were produced with next to no public input or knowledge. And indeed, the suburbs were deliberately designed to be self-sufficient so that there was no reason to go into the city center except for work. One newspaper article in the 1990s described the city after 5 p.m. as a, quote, ghost town. But a right to the city not only entails a spatial right of access to the center and its resources, and a right to participate in the production of the city. It also involves a right to participate in a vibrant urban life, which to Lefebvre, quote, suggests meetings, the confrontation of differences, reciprocal knowledge and acknowledgement, including ideological and political confrontation, ways of living, patterns which coexist in the city, end quote. In other words, urban life is characterized by the simultaneity of everyday functions and activities and the spontaneity of chance encounters with the unexpected. The loss of access to this kind of an urban life creates a perpetual state of boredom in suburbs and hyper-planned city centers around the world, one that is, quote, pregnant with desires, frustrated frenzies, unrealized possibilities, end quote. In sharp contrast to the diversity and integration of pre-oil Kuwait town, after 1990, work, residence, leisure, and commerce were separated out into discrete, increasingly privatized spheres. Affluence, coupled with state welfare, removed the need for mutual support between individuals and groups. And people withdrew into more self-contained and self-sustaining suburban lifestyles. In 1964, Fakhri Shihab, the Iraqi-born economic advisor to Kuwait's ruler, believed this, quote, new life of leisure and inertia had eroded Kuwaitis' sense of communal responsibility and mutuality. These social transformations were exacerbated by state housing schemes that segregated the population along class and sectarian lines, significantly restricting people's everyday interactions with those outside their social worlds. By 1982, the Kuwaiti geographer Abdurrasul al-Musa noted that residential segregation had imposed, quote, severe social barriers inside the Kuwaiti community that were, quote, dangerous and ominous for the future well-being of the state, end quote. Fast forward to the present, and Kuwaiti society today is in a very volatile state. In addition to the mall violence I described earlier, sectarian tensions between social groups like the Hadar, the former townspeople, and Bedouin have reached unprecedented and violent levels. Divisions between Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis are deeper than ever before. Migrant laborers and the Bidun, or stateless persons, face enormous human rights abuses in their daily lives. And every day, new laws get passed that further alienate and segregate expatriates. In early 2013, for instance, the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor announced plans to cut the number of expats residing in Kuwait by 1 million over the next 10 years, vowing to reduce the population by 100,000 annually. That summer, tens of thousands of expatriates were deported for traffic violations, including minor ones for which Kuwaitis only receive fines. In 2013, a reader's poll in a travel magazine ranked Kuwait the world's 5th unfriendliest city. Riyadh came in at 15th. While in 2014 and 2015, Kuwait ranked as the worst place for an expatriate to live out of 64 countries. The tolerance, mutuality, and cohesion that characterized Kuwait's, quote, primordial quality of urbanity for more than 2 centuries before oil has been replaced by a more insular, hostile, and parochial society. In my forthcoming book, I argue that the transformations to the built environment over the past 65 years since the advent of modern planning have been key to bringing about this social change. The cultural cosmopolitanism and cooperative public spirit that I believe have been lost in Kuwait over the past 60 years since the advent of oil require meaningful and repeated contact between people of different backgrounds, the slow experience of working, being, living, and playing with others. It is this kind of contact that was removed in post-1950 Kuwait by functional zoning, suburbanization, socio-spatial segregation, and the privatization of public space and public life. These urban policies replaced the tolerance, open-mindedness, and mutuality of the past with the more antagonistic and undemocratic social relations that prevail in Kuwait today. As Ash Amin and Nigel Thrift argue, in order for more democratic and cooperative everyday practices to develop within a society, people need to regularly experience negotiating diversity and difference rather than associating only with people like themselves or people they like. They suggest that the city, with its inherent diversity and multiplicity, is the primary place to experiment with encountering and confronting such difference. In other words, to return to Lefebvre, Kuwaiti society's lost urbanity could potentially be salvaged through a restoration of a right to the city, which again entails not only a right to spatial centrality, a shift from the suburbs back to the city, but also a renewed right to urban life, characterized by the integration of everyday functions and activities, regular encounters and negotiations with diverse people, ideas, and ways of living, and a right to participate in the production of the qualified spaces that make these experiences possible. Before we explore that idea further, let's return briefly to the state of Kuwait's urban landscape today. The development boom that oil triggered slowed down in the 1980s, and then the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990 to 91 marked the official halt to the process of oil urbanization that began in the 1950s. Kuwait faced a development lull for most of the post-occupation decade as matters of security, national defense, and post-war reconstruction became top priority. The deep freeze of the 1990s was also attributable to fear on the part of local and foreign investors of a repeat of the events of 1990 in Kuwait, leading those investors to turn elsewhere, including Dubai. It was not until 2003 that things began to change. Regime change in Iraq put Kuwait in the clear, while a surge in oil prices coupled with the influx of foreign, mainly Western, residents due to the high military, contractor, and business presence across the border triggered the country's second major post-oil construction boom. Other Gulf cities, like Dubai, had come of age during Kuwait's hiatus of the 1990s, and after 2003, Kuwait therefore attempted to make up for lost time. In 2004, the municipality exponentially increased floor area ratios in commercial areas, allowing buildings to rise up to more than 70 stories depending on plot size. Glass and steel high-rises housing luxury offices began to rapidly replace the characteristic low-rise modernist architecture of the 1950s and 60s. Shopping malls and luxury hotels and resorts have also constituted a major component of the new construction craze, wiping out Kuwait's few remaining public and mixed-use areas like this old outdoor commercial residential strip in Salmiya that since the 1960s had served as Kuwait's main shopping district. Kuwait and is now being replaced by a new shopping mall. Kuwait's current urbanization is thus even more alienating and pulverizing to urban life than before. Lefebvre argues that it is only once cities reach such extreme levels of urban destruction, when all legible urban reality as we once knew it, like streets, squares, parks, and cafes, the old Habermasian kind of cafes, of course, not Starbucks, disappear. Once these all disappear, that there rises a cry and demand for a restitution of these urban realities and for a restoration of an urban life defined by greater simultaneity and spontaneity. This is precisely what I think is occurring in Kuwait today. There are signs that young people in Kuwait today are demanding a restored right to the city on such terms, a right to use the spaces of the city in unrestricted and uncontrolled ways, to participate in the production of a city more after their own heart's desires, and a right to a vibrant and varied urban life. I should point out that despite the rapid pace of construction in Kuwait since 2003, and despite the fact that members of the public do not actively participate in the planning process, Kuwait's democratically elected parliament must approve all major plans and projects. Development in Kuwait is therefore inevitably slower than it is elsewhere in the Gulf, and the contentious nature of Kuwait's parliamentary politics over the past decade has meant that many major development projects have not yet been implemented. Although in the Gulf context this may be viewed as a hindrance, in reality the slower pace of urban development in Kuwait has created the space for civic groups to play a more active role in city formation than ever before in the region's history, post-oil history. Over the past few years in Kuwait, diverse and seemingly disparate groups and movements, from political protesters to architects and from neighborhood improvement projects to food markets, have been re-inhabiting the city and reinvigorating the urban experience in myriad ways. To borrow Richard Sennett's observation in 1970 of similar urban trends in the United States, it appears as though young people in Kuwait, quote, want actively to bring something new into being, something richer in social life than what the suburbs offer. End quote. Though on their own some of these movements might seem trivial or insignificant, I argue that collectively these youth groups have the potential to counter the deurbanizing tendencies of decades of top-down planning. One of the groups I believe has demonstrated a demand for a right to the city are political opposition forces who began taking to the streets in mass public demonstrations in 2011. Although the opposition was protesting against the Prime Minister for alleged political and financial corruption and was not explicitly addressing urban issues, the demonstrations represented a public desire to lay claim to the city for political purposes. After independence in 1961, the city center was transformed into a controlled landscape of state power in which political contestation and public protest was rare. It was no longer the space of political discussion and debate as it was in the pre-oil era, because the spaces that once gave form to the urban public sphere, diwaniyas and civil society organizations, were shifted out to the suburbs. Diwaniyas are semi-public gatherings held in private homes since well before the coming of oil, in which men, and recently also sometimes women, meet to discuss political and economic issues, check the power of the ruling family, and of course to socialize. In December 2010, a political gathering of anti-government activists held in the private diwania of an opposition leader was raided by government special forces. In early 2011, just as thousands of demonstrators were convening on Tahrir Square in Cairo and Pearl Roundabout in Manama, Kuwait's youth-based opposition planned to hold a public demonstration in Sahet al-Safat, the historic public town square before oil, which was transformed into a modern plaza in the early 1980s. Al-Safat is located in the heart of the central business district and is partly a traffic circle where multiple main roads meet. Though some small protests occurred there that January, the first public demonstrations in Al-Safat since the Arab nationalist protests of the 1950s, before the movement gained momentum, the government swiftly cordoned off the plaza, and the municipality eventually announced plans for the site's 3 million dinar two-year renovation. The protesters were forced to restrict their activities to a stretch of grass facing the Parliament building, between the entrance to a heritage village and a large parking lot, which was easier to control as there's only one access road to the place. This space, which the opposition named Irada, or Determination Square, became the site of numerous public demonstrations over the following 2 years, used by political groups of all leanings, not just those opposed to the government. Pro-government groups, women's rights activists, and Bidoun rights campaigners all held demonstrations in this space throughout the next 2 to 3 years of intense political contestation. Despite the closure of Sahet al-Safat and continuous government efforts to restrict mass rallies and demonstrations in the city in recent months, Irada restored a historic function to the city center, public politics, after decades of being relegated to the periphery. Political activists of all stripes are no longer content to voice their demands in the privatized world of the suburbs, and Irada has become a spatial symbol of a public demand not only for political, economic, and social equality, but also for a right to occupy the central spaces of power to make those demands. Nonetheless, the protesters' claims on the city are somewhat incidental to their political demands. They are staking a right to the city almost unconsciously. At the other extreme is a group whose demands for rights to the city are much more direct, deliberate, and conscious. These are young local architects and intellectuals who have been engaging in a critical urban discourse over the past few years, arguably for the first time in Kuwait since the advent of oil. One group, known as the Arabana Project, established in 2010, has worked towards increasing public participation in urban planning in various ways. organizing focus groups on behalf of the municipality in connection to various urban projects, public projects, hosting town hall meetings on subjects such as public housing, and so on. Kuwait's participation in the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2012 and 14, both curated by young local architects and artists, similarly opened up public debates on Kuwait's urbanism through local lectures, discussions, and exhibitions that were held in both years in conjunction with the country's Biennale pavilions. Some architects, like Zahra Ali Baba and Dima Laghnaim, both of whom curated the 2012 pavilion, have taken the lead over the past few years in increasing public awareness and appreciation for the conservation of historic buildings, particularly Kuwait's iconic modernist architecture that since the start of the building boom in the mid-2000s has unfortunately been subject to rapid demolition. In 2014, these architects organized Kuwait's first ever anti-demolition protest against the planned destruction of the country's first Chamber of Commerce building. Although sadly it did not save the building, the small protest did increase public awareness about urban conservation. In a country where since 1950, buildings have been built to be demolished within an average of 25 years, this was a significant step towards greater urban and environmental sustainability. One of the most interesting groups in this category is Medina, a group of 5 young women who curate alternative walking tours of the city. The purpose behind Medina's walking tours is to get residents out of their cars and onto the streets, and to become more familiar with the built environment from which they have largely been estranged since the move to the suburbs and the privatization of everyday experiences after oil. The tours are sometimes given by guest guides who share their own understandings and experiences of the spaces they traverse and explore on the tour. Some tours explore the hidden and unexpected parts of particular neighborhoods. Others focus on a particular theme, such as a tour conducted by a local young Kuwaiti chef that explores the city's fish markets and other food-related spaces before ending with a meal at his restaurant. And still others take participants, mostly middle-class suburbanites, to the vibrant shops, squares, and back alley restaurants frequented mostly by the city's predominantly South and Southeast Asian residents. Each tour aims to give its participants a different experience of the city than what they would normally encounter in their daily routines. The goal is to make people feel more connected to their city in the hopes that they will feel more inclined to become active participants in the production, maintenance, and governance of their built environment, and that they will demand something better than what the past 65 years of oil urbanization has brought. And although I cannot necessarily attribute this specifically to Medina's efforts, there has certainly been a greater public concern for the state of the built environment over the past couple of years. For instance, these are images of some of the Medina tours. Mantaqa Mi is a newly established volunteer project that leads local residents in cleaning up public spaces in their neighborhoods, like parks, as well as common parts of the city, like underpasses and public squares. Medina's walking tours also constitute a form of collective knowledge production on the city. They hope to collect and make publicly available all the information gathered for each tour in an online archive. By making residents, both citizens and expatriates, the active producers of knowledge on the city, rather than the state-hired foreign planners and experts who have been producing master plans for Kuwait since 1951, Medina is staking public rights to the city in both material and discursive ways. Perhaps the clearest evidence of a budding desire for a new kind of urban experience in Kuwait is the growing popularity of the city center as a place for small local businesses. The third group that I argue is claiming a right to the city. The establishment of homegrown cafes, restaurants, shops, and art galleries is a new trend among young Kuwaitis that began in the mid-2000s. Many of these young business owners are unable to afford the high rents and overhead of shopping malls, besides which many don't want to open in privatized complexes. The city center has offered a viable, affordable, and experiential alternative that young entrepreneurs have capitalized on, and they're revitalizing the city center in ways that no previous state-led attempt has been able to achieve. The trend started in 2005 in this area when a couple of young businesses moved into a dilapidated strip of shops along the Gulf Road. The original shops sold fishing and sailing equipment catering to the nearby port and dhow harbors, but in the late 80s, most of the harbors were removed and the shops declined. When the new businesses started moving in, the area was renovated and became Kuwait City's first example of unplanned urban gentrification. The area's success drew attention to the city center as a potential haven for small businesses, particularly given the presence of old buildings with cheaper rents. Over the past few years, several formerly derelict areas have been revitalized, with citizens rather than the municipality or private developers taking the lead in cleaning up, renovating, and transforming parts of the city into trendy new districts. The potential effects of such citizen-led urban projects are mixed. Although spontaneous rather than planned developments, these gentrified districts are highly commercialized and remain the purview of the social elite. Most of the cafes and restaurants are unaffordable to the majority of expatriates who live and work in the city. Their main clientele are Kuwaitis who work in the central business district during the day and visit on their lunch breaks. But for the first time in decades, they are also luring middle-class Kuwaitis out of their suburbs and shopping malls into the city at night and on weekends. Although some of these new areas feel clearly segregated from the surrounding city, which since the 70s has been predominantly occupied by low-income migrant workers, young Kuwaiti suburbanites are coming into closer proximity to and more regular contact with different kinds of people and ways of living. So this area here, which is a more recently developed area with young trendy restaurants, if you go through this alley right here, you come out onto this plaza here, which is predominantly a space frequented by lower income migrant workers. So very close together, but clearly segregated. Members of these separate social worlds increasingly penetrate the spaces occupied by the other as they move through the city, particularly as parking is hard to come by and people have to walk through the city to reach their destinations. Without over-romanticizing the point, the gap between Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis, the rich and the poor, the bureaucrat and the laborer, does shrink tremendously inside the city, more so than in the suburbs or in the avenues, making these businesses important hubs for the growth of a new urbanity. Arguably, the strongest current claim to public rights to the city in Kuwait is located in Salmiya, Kuwait's main commercial district, rather than the city center. A community gardening project known as the Secret Garden, kick-started in September 2014 by a young woman named Maryam al-Nasif. Bored with her suburban lifestyle and craving, as she put it, quote, a real experience, Maryam, her mother, and a small group of friends began cleaning up a rundown garden close to her family home in Salmiya. They dug a compost pit in one sector, built picnic tables and benches in another, and planted another large sector with a variety of vegetables, herbs, plants, and flowers. The experience of the Secret Garden emphasizes the value of demographic and functional diversity in city districts. Salmiya is one of Kuwait's only mixed areas, combining residential, commercial, educational, and bureaucratic uses. And though the majority of its residents are non-Kuwaitis living in rented accommodation, some parts of the district contain Kuwaiti-owned villas, which is where Maryam lives. As a community project, the garden has started to bridge the gap between Salmiya's otherwise segregated national and non-national residents. The involvement of Maryam and other Kuwaiti residents facilitated the government's repair of the badly damaged water and electricity infrastructure, which had been neglected for years. Maintenance in predominantly non-Kuwaiti areas is notoriously poor. When they saw the place being revived, various residents of the neighborhood, from young children to elderly women, immediately got involved. A South Asian worker who lives in the area turns the compost pits a few times a week, while an American landscape architect who stumbled on the project while walking home one day volunteers regularly with his own technical expertise. Maryam lives in the neighborhood with her mother and grandmother, but it was only through the garden that they became friends. This is Maryam on the left here. It was only through the garden that they became friends with a group of Arab women who live in an older building adjacent to the space. Maryam's grandmother, in her late 60s, did not previously socialize with non-Kuwaitis. She was used to spending most hours of her day at home watching television. She now joins these women every weekend when they sit outside their building drinking coffee and talking, and does yoga every afternoon with an instructor who lives in the neighborhood and sometimes holds free classes in the garden. It was when she noticed how dramatically the garden changed her own grandmother's behavior that Maryam realized the transformative potential of this little space. Local businesses have been getting involved in the garden too. Nearby takeaway restaurants and juice shops donate their food scraps for the compost pit, while the physiotherapists who work at a sports clinic next door sometimes lead the volunteers in stretches and exercises after a long day of gardening. The once derelict space has been completely revived and is now used at different times of day by different people. Neighborhood children play there, teenagers hang out there at night to smoke and play cards, employees of the area eat on the benches during their lunch break, and so on. Every other Saturday, the Secret Garden volunteers host a small-scale food market in the garden, using the fees the vendors pay to sustain their activities. The vendors are of mixed nationalities and backgrounds, as are the members of the public who attend, many of whom wander in from the neighborhood. The garden is perhaps Kuwait's only current example of unplanned and cooperative urbanism. No single group controls the space, and all have equal rights of access to it. And in a city where urban space is highly privatized, commercialized, and controlled, it is a rare public space of the kind Andy Merrifield describes as, quote, a vibrant, open public forum full of lived moments and enchanting encounters, end quote. The state's response to all this activity has been mixed. On the one hand, the state's response to the protesters' convergence on the city was more contentious and obstructive, closing down Sahat al-Safat, using roadblocks to restrict access to Irada, using tear gas to disperse demonstrators, and so on. On the other hand, over the past year, a new space has opened in Kuwait City that represents the state's first attempt at encouraging broader participation in the management and governance of public space. Al-Shahid Park, located on the edge of Kuwait City in the green belt that separates the city from the suburbs, is a 200,000 square meter landscaped urban green space developed by the Diwan Al-Amiri, the office of the ruler, containing botanical gardens, historical and environmental museums, walkways and jogging tracks, an amphitheater, a multipurpose auditorium, cafes, gift shops, and so on. Once completed in early 2015, the Diwan handed over management of the park to the Lothan Youth Achievement Center, LOYAC, in order to give Kuwaiti youth the opportunity to, quote, help cultivate and nurture the arts, history, and culture, end quote, by organizing events in the park. LOYAC is also responsible for the park's maintenance, cleanliness, and security. There is a possible political connection between Irada and Al-Shahid Park. In the wake of the highly contentious political opposition movement of 2011 and the simultaneous uprisings elsewhere in the region, over the past few years, the Kuwaiti government has made a more concerted effort to engage Kuwaiti youth in the political process in order to discourage them from joining opposition forces. As a Kuwait Youth Project was formed to give young Kuwaitis the opportunity to identify what they saw as the country's biggest problems and to come up with solutions to be presented to the ruler. This was considered a preferable method to voice their concerns than taking their grievances to Irada. Al-Shahid Park similarly gives Kuwaiti youth a large space that gives them a sense of participation and engagement, but in a much more secure and controllable manner than Irada. It should be noted that the renovated Sahat al-Safat reopened at the same time as Al-Shahid Park in early 2015. The historically open space is now gated and locked at all times and may only be used for official events or with prior state permission. But while it may therefore be tempting to view these government attempts at co-opting the youth somewhat cynically, the fact remains that many young people are getting involved in decision-making in the country. The architect Abdelatif al-Mishari, who started the Arabana project I mentioned earlier and is a strong advocate for public participation in urban planning, is now a member of the advisory board to the Prime Minister's Higher Council for Planning, a position he earned after his active and impressive participation in the National Youth Project, in which he focused on public housing issues. Aside from these particular examples where state authorities have been deliberately both obstructive and conciliatory to public demands, for the most part, the official response to much of this activity has been indifferent and somewhat uncooperative. Kuwait has notoriously difficult and strict laws governing the establishment of small businesses, and the institutions involved, like the Ministry of Commerce and Industry and the municipality, have done nothing to cultivate the new entrepreneurial spirit among young Kuwaitis. Arabana, for instance, began as a mixed-use collective workspace in a renovated warehouse in Shweikh back in, I think it was 2009, Kuwait's main industrial district. Their intention was to rent out various spaces in the warehouse to diverse entrepreneurial and design initiatives as a way of supporting young creatives by giving them a place to set up their projects and share ideas. However, the Ministry of Commerce labeled the initiative an incubator, and in Kuwait, incubators can only exist as national projects, so run by the state. This was the first time a private initiative like this had been presented to the authorities, but rather than considering amending the laws to accommodate this new interest, they simply refused to license them. And so Arabana was never really able to create the collective workspace they had hoped for. In the years since, several similar creative and collective workspaces have emerged and have also been forced to work around strict licensing laws. Similarly, the Secret Garden's bi-monthly food market, which is extremely small and serves as a way for the volunteers to make a bit of money to help sustain the garden, has faced some obstacles from government departments due to the law restricting the use of state-owned land for commercial purposes. Food and farmers markets in general have been growing in popularity in Kuwait over the past couple of years, but have been forced to function in private spaces. Like this popular market that takes place once a month, last year on the top floor of a parking garage of a private mall in the city, and this year in a new outdoor commercial development area, defeating the purpose of a public street market. Similarly, the food truck craze that has become popular around the world has reached Kuwait too. Like street markets, food trucks get people out of the private spaces of the city, like offices, malls, and restaurants, and make them engage directly with the city's streets and public spaces, and therefore with the diverse people using those spaces. But again, the country's laws restricting commercial activity on public land means that food trucks can only operate on private property, like universities, or at private events, like this motorsport event. Nonetheless, the growing pressure from these diverse new youth-based initiatives is slowly forcing state authorities to revisit many of the country's archaic licensing laws. For instance, new policies are currently being developed to facilitate home and mobile businesses like food trucks, and also forcing them to loosen the control on how public spaces can be used in Kuwait. So to conclude, restoring a right to the city is not an end in itself. It is a step towards a bigger goal. In Kuwait, I believe that bigger goal is restoring Kuwaiti society's primordial quality of urbanity, characterized for more than 200 years by its tolerant, cosmopolitan outlook and its public cooperative spirit. Sorry, that was the wrong slide. As Amin and Thrift argue, quote, "The city is more than a place of common access and encounter. It is a place of becoming and the fulfillment of social potential, of democratic experimentation through the efforts of citizens themselves," end quote. As some of the aforementioned projects suggest, cities offer new possibilities to transform people into more active citizens, meaning the active participation in the business of rule. It was this kind of active citizenship that was missing the night Jabir Yusuf was murdered in the avenues. To experience citizenship as an everyday practice, that is, to enhance the ability of social actors to intervene in public life, people need to constantly experience interacting with and negotiating between different people, ideas, activities, experiences, and ways of life. The city itself, not the suburbs or the avenues, is the key site for such hybridization and the strengthening of mutuality, as it was in Kuwait town before oil. Thank you.
I just had a quick question. You mentioned Shahid Park, the new development. How is that being used by the public? Because it sounded like you were just describing it as a way to keep youth busy. So I'm just curious how that's working out in practice.
Okay. It's been very, so as I mentioned, NYUAD, which is this youth group that's in charge of managing the space, has been very active. And so it's used, there's a lot of activity going on, but it's not spontaneous activity. So I think they've been looking at places like the Secret Garden and other places that a lot of people are starting to use in these different kinds of activities. You have theater groups that go in and use the space. You had people doing yoga in the garden, and that was all happening spontaneously in the Secret Garden without any planning or permission or anything like that. So the garden, the park, Shahid Park, is starting to do similar kinds of activities, but it's very regulated. You have to go through the administration. It's, I think, this is a picture of the park. You can see it's flanked by two highways, and it's not easily accessible. You have to drive into an underground parking garage. It's not really a public park. So they're trying to be very active and getting the youth involved and NYUAD involved, giving them a sense of ownership over the space, which is very new. So although it's not really being used as a public space, that idea of giving parks in the past in Kuwait used to be closed all the time because the whole idea was that we have to keep the park well maintained. And so nobody, but still, even that, though this is more open and they're trying to get people to use it, there's a lot of rules. You can't eat in the garden, in the park. You can't barbecue or picnic. No ball games allowed. So they're still struggling with this idea of how do we make this a public space versus the more spontaneous kinds of places like the Secret Garden, where there is no sense of control but so it's getting there, but it's a different kind of public use. If that sort of answers your question. But it's very active, but yeah, it's controlled activity.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if you could comment on whether you see this kind of transformation happening in other Gulf cities, such as Abu Dhabi, where the same kind of suburban privatization of public space is happening?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. I haven't looked enough. I know, anecdotally, I hear from friends, for instance, who live in Dubai, that there are some sort of movements in that. Definitely in Bahrain, and Bahrain started off earlier on, especially when you look at things like small businesses and art galleries and things using the spaces of the city very in unplanned and uncontrolled ways. And in some ways, Bahrain started that even earlier than Kuwait did. I don't know. I guess that might be a question that I would pose back. I don't know enough in Abu Dhabi if, for instance, that's happening here. I do think, though, that it eventually will happen in any city. Any city that, like Kuwait and other cities in the Gulf, that are highly controlled, highly privatized, regulated, zoned, where you have this kind of dismembered sort of everyday life where you go to work here and you go to, I think inevitably residents of the city start to reject that. It was happening in the US in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, after the move to the suburbs in the post-World War II period. And in particular, when you look at other cities of affluence, people start to get bored with that status quo. So I do think it's a matter of time in any city where you start to see these more bottom-up trends emerging. There may be a bit of a difference in Kuwait just because it's a different kind of political landscape as well as urban landscape, insofar as there is generally more spaces of participation and public participation in other aspects of politics and in civil society organization and things like that. So I don't know if that creates a bit more of a space, but I do think it sort of comes out in every city eventually.
You mentioned a bottleneck caused by Parliament blocking a lot of these major urban development projects from coming to fruition. What needs to happen for that to open up, and what effect will that have on Kuwait City?
Yeah, I think, one of the main reasons why a lot of major development projects get stalled in Parliament is because certain groups within Parliament rightly believe that a lot of these projects are just mired in corruption, and that they're mainly going to benefit, sort of the elite merchant families and so on, which is usually true. And so I think, I think it's just a matter of time and some of the projects are slowly coming in and moving through, but I think inevitably it's just a matter of having to take some time. I don't see it as necessarily a negative or a hindrance. I think a slower pace is sometimes okay. What is starting to happen is places like Al Shahid Park, and we have two major cultural spaces coming up, a museum and sort of an opera house / museum / hotel, something complex on the edge of the city, which are now being done by the Diwan Amiri, the ruler's office, directly. So that sidesteps the parliament, the political deadlock, the municipality, the corruption, and the bureaucracy, basically. But there's two sides to that. On the one hand, we get the park and these museums have been done very rapidly, much quicker, much better quality, no, under the table sort of deals that really make the quality of the space suffer. These are beautiful spaces and so on. But the flip side of it is that they're being done completely top down, without any sort of public input and participation. And a lot of people like these places, so it's hard to gauge what's the risk factor that comes along with that. But it is happening, and that's never happened in Kuwait before, where urban projects get developed by the Diwan Amiri. That's new. So the outcome of that long term, we have yet to really see, but there are two sides to how we could view this process. But that's coming up as one of the solutions. And I think these bottom-up movements are a solution to the deadlock, that they're filling in the gaps that our parliament is not doing.
Thanks for your presentation. The only thing that I thought was missing is the importance of public transportation. I was wondering what, how do you think that factors into this problem?
That's a key issue. Streets, first starting even before we get to public transportation, sidewalks, walking, is the number one kind of public space. It's the kind of public space that people share, and are forced to negotiate difference constantly, even without thinking. You're walking down a city street, you are constantly making these silent agreements with the people around you that you're not even conscious of. And I think when, so streets, and by extension, therefore, also public transport, because cars are privatized spaces in public places. So I do think that public transportation is key, because it's the kind of space that will bring people together, truly bring a multitude of people together of mixed backgrounds, much more than any other kind of public space we can think of. Because there will always be a certain amount of selection in terms, if we're looking at a park or something like that. But streets are there as a matter of fact. So I do think public transportation is key, and we don't have, we have a very declined bus system in Kuwait that's really in poor condition, and a lot of people who have the opportunity to have a car don't use it. So yeah, and our metro plan is one of those plans that's been lingering in the parliament for the past, actually it's been on the books since about 1977, I think. So supposedly I just heard recently that they're very, it's actually going through right now. I heard from someone in the planning council. But again, we've been hearing that since the 70s, so we'll see.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering about the comment you made that the kind of need or demand for public spaces arises naturally at a certain point. You mentioned New York as an example, but in Kuwait, it's not just, as I understand it, a problem of the availability of the space itself, but of the government allowing the space that may be there to be used in a public fashion. So if this continues to be hindered, do you think still people will find a way around it, like water flows through the cracks, something will be found, or? Okay, thanks.
No, that's a great question, because we have no shortage of space. I do think that there already are finding ways around. And I'll use again the secret garden as an example, And so you had these it was very active and all kinds of people were using it. And then they started doing the street market, every other week. And after about 6 months of that, the government started to crack down. The Ministry of, Agriculture and Fisheries and the Ministry of Commerce, because it's public land and you can't and so these are these very outdated laws that need to accommodate these new kinds of initiatives. And so they were forced to stop. They stopped for a few weeks or a couple months. And now they've gone back, and they know that it's a risk because it could jeopardize everything else that they're doing in the garden, which the government has been very actually cooperative. Like when they first decided to go in and fix things up and they realized that there was no water mains or even or electricity, they went to the ministries and they got them to turn everything on. And so there was some cooperation and support. But they're doing it anyway. Now they've started doing and it's on Instagram, it's all over, everyone knows. And we sometimes are there and you see the sort of government officials walking around. I think what they're doing is there is a slow change. They didn't immediately come and shut down, which they easily could have. They're sort of taking a step back. So they're in discussion. And like I mentioned, the same thing happened with home businesses. Home businesses flourished over recent years, particularly with Instagram. I don't know if that's as popular here, but Instagram businesses. And home businesses were a problem because there's no way to monitor them because they're home. So, and food businesses in particular, you can't inspect them and so on. So now they're finding ways around that. And they were operating anyway. And so when they realize that they can't shut them down and how popular they've become. So I actually think that there is slowly that uncooperative sort of computer says no kind of response is slowly changing.